welcome to the Earth Feels podcast.
I'm Rose.
And I'm Christine.
Welcome to Earth Feels, the podcast for people feeling overwhelmed by the endlessly gloomy climate news.
Where every week we have soul-based conversations about climate change and explore the idea that climate change may be happening for us as much as it is happening to us.
If you are ready to shift your focus and secure the future for our kids and our grandkids, then this is the podcast for you.
And yes, we do know how to spell. COP26, the United Nations Annual Climate Summit, is starting on Sunday, October 31st, and is going to be running for 2 weeks. And it's being held in Glasgow, Scotland. The decisions that are made at COP26 will decide the future climate for all of us, including the youth and those in less economically developed nations who have contributed the least to the pollution that is changing the world's climate. So here at Earth Feels, we wanted to give youth, particularly youth from those countries that have contributed the least to the problem of global warming, but yet who are often on the front lines feeling the greatest impacts of climate change at this time already. And of course, it will only get worse as time goes on. We hear from the World Bank, the International Energy Agency. We hear from the politicians who are going to be at COP. And we certainly hear from the fossil fuel industry and their lobbyists who keep repeating their message that this shift to clean energy is too hard, it's too expensive, yada yada, or blah blah blah, as Greta Thunberg would say. So today's Earth Feels episode is an opportunity for some of those voices that aren't often heard in this discussion and certainly are not going to be at the front table at COP26. To answer the question, what would I say to the leaders meeting at COP26? I'm Christine, your host for this episode. We're going to start by introducing you to Rose Kopsengi. She is a climate justice activist from Uganda who is passionate about advancing climate and social justice, biodiversity conservation, social inclusion, and the empowerment of the most vulnerable children, women, and youth across less economically developed countries.
Hi, my name is Rose Kopsengi, a climate justice activist from Uganda. As we go to COP26, I'm reminding all global and local leaders that climate change is real, that climate change affects everyone. But most unfortunately, the most vulnerable women, youth, children, indigenous groups, displaced people, and marginalized groups suffer the most from the brutal impacts of climate change. It's our leaders' task to protect these people, to protect the future lives and livelihoods of the young people and the most vulnerable. COP26 must be about protecting people and planet from the existential threats of climate change. Climate justice and biodiversity justice must be at the center of every decision and negotiation in Glasgow. Most importantly, the implementation after COP26 is the one that will determine the kind of leaders that we have. We shall judge our leaders by the decisions they make in Glasgow and by the implementation that they practice after COP26. Climate justice is what we need. Social justice is what we need. And there is no planet B.
Thank you, Rose, for that strong, clear message. A World bank report, Groundswell, that was released in September of 2021, predicts that there will be 216 million climate refugees by 2050 if we carry on the trajectory that we are on with our emissions. Sub-Saharan Africa, of which Uganda is part, as well as Nigeria and Ethiopia, and we're going to hear from people from both of those countries coming up. Sub-Saharan Africa alone could see as many as 86 million people displaced because of climate-related impacts. We're not talking just statistics here. We're talking real people that are going to be affected by the decisions that are made or not made at COP26 and the actions that are taken moving forward after COP26. Next, we're going to hear from Khalid Mohammed. He is a young climate leader from Ethiopia and was a delegate for his country at the pre-COP Youth for Climate Conference in Milan, Italy in September. He can be found on Twitter at, his handle is at Calidopia. And I should say I'm going to put the social media information for each speaker who's included in today's podcast will be on the episode webpage. So check it out at earthfieldspodcast.com. So you can definitely connect with them on social media if you want. Now over to Khalid.
The recent IPCC report is code red for humanity. A 1.5 degree centigrade increase in temperature is the death knell for the livelihoods of millions of communities in Africa. I want to tell the world leaders that we young people, especially from the least developed countries, seek ambitious actions and climate justice. We don't want empty promises. Show us the money. As an old Ethiopian proverb goes, "Dirbi abar anbasa yasir," which means if spider webs come together, it can tame a lion. All nations need to come together to solve the climate change problem. We seek intergenerational justice. Stop stealing our future from us. Actions speak louder than words. My country, Ethiopia, apart from submitting an ambitious NDC, we planted 9 billion trees through the Green Legacy Initiative, which was launched in 2019. We, as a least developed country, are taking ambitious actions. It is such a shame for developed nations if you don't raise your ambitions. And the last thing I want to say is that we are watching you. I was representing Ethiopia at the pre-COP26, and we were able to produce a document and presented it to the ministers and world leaders who were at the ministerial pre-COP. As we said, nothing about us without us. We are coming to COP26 to ensure that the outcomes of the pre-COP are incorporated to the COP26 decisions.
Thank you, Khalid, for that clear message to the leaders meeting at COP over the next few weeks. If anybody is interested in learning more about Ethiopia's Green Legacy Initiative, which aims to plant 20 billion trees in 4 years, I'll provide a link on the episode webpage. And Khalid also mentioned the demands that the youth produced after their pre-COP26 conference in Milan, Italy. I'm quoting from an article, which I will link to, also on the episode webpage, talking about the list of demands that the youth came up with at their summit. Nearly 20 demands to COP26 came out of the Youth for Climate discussions, which circled around meaningful participation, just transition funding, and more backing for climate change education. And I will link to that article in the National Observer for those who want to learn more. Before leaving the African continent, we are going to hear from one more young climate activist. Aziz Abubakar is from Nigeria and has a background in civil engineering. He was also a delegate at the pre-COP Youth for Climate meeting in Milan, Italy for his country. And he will introduce himself and his perspective a little bit more.
My name is Aziz Abubakar and I am from Nigeria. I'm a young climate champion. I have a background in civil engineering, and I'm particularly driven towards supporting the most vulnerable communities impacted by the climate crisis. I think that world leaders at COP26 should prioritize adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage, as a lot of communities across Africa, especially, are being impacted the most by the worst impacts of climate change. These communities have contributed the least to causing climate change impact and suffer the most from it. So therefore, world leaders of developed countries need to ensure that they announce and pledge big commitments to not just commitment, but taking the action needed to ensure that this is a reality, making sure that the most vulnerable communities are supported during the climate crisis. This is my vision for the COP26 and what I would like world leaders to take and to pledge at COP26. Thank you.
Thank you, Aziz, for responding so clearly and concisely to the question, what would I say to the leaders who are meeting at COP26? And Aziz mentioned that part of his message to the leaders meeting at COP is that they should prioritize adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage. And I'm just going to highlight loss and damage a little bit in case anybody listening isn't familiar with it. Carbonbrief.org, when talking about loss and damage, says scaling down our emissions and building resilience against climate change can only take us so far. Some negative impacts and damages are now unavoidable. The inevitable consequences of human-caused climate change have collectively come to be known as loss and damage. And increasingly, countries most impacted by climate change, as we've talked about, are usually the ones that are least economically developed and have contributed the least to the carbon emissions that are destabilizing the climate. And not surprisingly, they want to talk about loss and damage impacts on them that are bearing the brunt of extreme weather or rising seas. And as you can imagine, this is a fairly contentious issue. Internationally, there's been some steps taken towards agreeing on it. I think most recently in 2015, the Paris Agreement included some more reference to loss and damage. Anyways, this isn't the place to go to take a deep dive into it, but there will be links in the episode webpage if anybody wants to get a more fuller explanation about dealing with the loss and damage caused by climate change. But it's not the only time it will come up in this podcast episode, and just be aware that the youth, particularly the youth in less economically developed countries, are very aware of the issue of loss and damage. So let's leave Africa and travel to South Asia, specifically to Pakistan, which is the world's fifth most populous country with a coastline of over 1,000 kilometers bordering the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman, which of course makes it vulnerable to sea level rise, among other impacts of climate change. So let's hear what Zainab Waheed, a 16-year-old climate activist from Pakistan, has to say to world leaders meeting at COP26.
The COP26 will decide if we are to live or let the climate chaos render us to doom. I would hate to see the policymakers treat this conference as just another talking shop. I want to see them living up to their past promises instead of making new lofty ones. More importantly, we need them to define accountability measures for themselves to ensure that they actually fulfill their commitments. I also want to see them securing climate education for every student, finalizing the Paris Agreement rulebook, and ensuring that countries from around the world have access to the resources that they need to deal with the loss and damages resulting from climate change.
Thank you, Wahid, for that passionate and clear message for the leaders meeting at COP26. You can find her on Twitter at, her handle is USWAE Zanab, ZAINAB3. That's Uswa Zanab 3 on Twitter. And again, that'll be on the episode webpage. Now we're going to travel over to Europe, where we're going to hear from Yann Gaget, who was born in France, and he is a biologist with a special interest in climate change and bats. He has a PhD in bat research and is currently working in the field of molecular diagnostics. You can follow him on Twitter at BatYan and find him on his website. It's allaboutclimate.wordpress.com.
Planet Earth is our home and the only planet in the whole universe where life is known. Life has been evolving on this lonely planet for about 3.5 billion of years, resulting in a great diversity of forms, colors, and behaviors that we know today. Within 250 years, a tiny fraction of the history of life on Earth, our species, Homo sapiens, has massively consumed fossil fuels. This has resulted, in combination with other human activities, to a climate crisis and ecological crisis affecting us and all other living beings. Dear leaders of the COP26, you have an immense historical responsibility. But you also have great opportunities to make this event a turning point in healing the climate. After losing decades, we all now have to double down on climate action. We owe it to people from the Global South, we owe it to all the living animals, plants, and other forms of life, some even not described by science yet. And we owe it to the future generations. Dear leaders of the COP26, be on the right side of history.
Thank you, Jan, for giving us a reminder of the history of our emissions and, of course, that call to the leaders at COP26 to be on the right side of history. And speaking of history, the last continent we're going to drop in on for this podcast episode is North America. Of course, that's where I am, here on Turtle Island, as the Indigenous people call North America. Sanaji Artis is going to speak to us from his perspective. He's American, and I'm sure it's no surprise to any of you that the United States has historically, that is, over the last hundreds of years, contributed more climate damaging emissions than any other single country to date. And that includes China. So we are very happy to welcome the point of view of a young climate activist from the United States. And Sanaji Artis has quite the track record already. There's even a Wikipedia entry for him. Sanaji co-founded the youth-led climate activist group 0 Hour in 2017, and he continues to be involved with that as policy director. He also has a podcast entitled 1.5, a kids' climate justice podcast, in which he co-hosts with Olivia Greenspan, and he and Olivia also authored a book together entitled A Kid's Book on Climate Change. And I could go on, but now let's hear Sanaji speak for himself. What would he say to the leaders meeting at COP26?
I want to say to the world leaders meeting at COP26 that the time for incremental action is over and that it is way past time to end government support for fossil fuels. Globally, hundreds of billions of dollars are spent on fossil fuel subsidies every year while the planet continues to warm. These projects, subsidized by tax dollars, are threatening ecosystems and disproportionately harming the livelihood of Indigenous peoples and Black and Brown people. Governments have the power to end fossil fuel subsidies and instead incentivize renewable energy, fund mass transit and high-speed rail, and incentives for electric vehicles, and modernize electricity grids for renewable energy capacity and storage. We know the science of climate change and the timeline we have left to reach zero emissions. Zero, not net zero, because net zero obscures actual commitments. It is a model that allows companies and governments to continue burning fossil fuels while also claiming that they've done their part to reduce emissions because of purchased offsets that may or may not sequester the equivalent emissions at any given time. Lastly, I want to say to listen to Indigenous leaders and frontline communities being impacted by this issue every day. Their perspectives must be included in policy solutions for a just transition to occur.
Thank you, Zanaji. You packed a lot into that short but very clear and concise message to the leaders meeting at COP. And I have to say, you touched on fossil fuel subsidies, which make me crazy as well. We hear over and over again from our governments that it's too expensive to address climate change. And of course, we know that climate change effects are getting more and more damaging and expensive to address every year. And at the same time, while we're being told that it's too expensive to address climate change and shift our economy, we are literally globally giving billions and billions and even trillions of dollars to the fossil fuel companies. So I couldn't agree with you more on that one, Zanaji. And I just want to thank each and every one of the people that added their voice to this podcast today. It has been, for me, hosting such a rich experience to hear such diverse voices. It has also, I have to say, inspired me, actually, to hear such articulate and passionate youth who are doing all they can to steer the course of our world to a livable future for everyone, a more equitable future for everyone, where there's social justice and climate justice. So thank you all. Merci beaucoup for adding your voice, and obviously, especially for those of you whose English is not your first language, I appreciate the effort that you made to speak to our audience, and I will be adding on the episode website a transcript of each of these contributors' messages. So if you need clarification, just head over to the website. So we usually talk about good news, and I have to say, other than the good news of being inspired by these voices who are out there doing all they can for the future, there is good news in other ways as well. The University of Toronto just announced this week that they are divesting at least $4 billion from their from fossil fuels. So hooray for that. Also, kind of exciting, even though it lines Elon Musk's pocket. Hertz Rent-A-Car just announced that it's going to buy 100,000 Teslas over the next year and a half, I believe. So that's a pretty big deal to make the experience of driving an electric vehicle much more accessible and widespread for people. So that's the good news for today. Stay tuned to COP26. We will be talking about it in the days and weeks ahead. As for an action tip, I would say find one or more of the contributors to today's podcast on social media, if you are on, and follow them. Let them know you appreciate what they have to say. You appreciate the passion that they bring to what they do. And if you're really inspired this week, and COP26 is crunch time, so if not now, then when? You might want to take a page out of their book, inspired by them, and communicate with your leaders, whether it's your local politicians or at a more provincial or state level or right up to the federal level, to let them know that you are concerned about climate change. I have to say, I tried to leave a message for our Prime Minister this week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and I couldn't find his new phone number because, he was just re-elected a couple of weeks ago. Apparently, they haven't posted his new phone number online. So I called his constituency office and got a call back when I was in Glasgow a couple of days ago from Justin Trudeau's office, following up on the call that I made. So I joked that Justin Trudeau called me while I was out and about, but in fact, it was his office, which kudos to them for following up. So you never know where a call to your elected representative might lead. You only know if you don't do it that nothing will happen. I want to add some good news because Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, announced his new cabinet a couple of days ago, and Canada's new Minister of Environment and Climate Change is a former Greenpeace activist. He's from Quebec, and he founded the environmental group Equiterre about 30 years ago. And so he has a very strong record as a climate activist. He's actually climbed and suspended himself from the CN Tower in Toronto to bring attention to the lack of climate action by Canada. So very interesting appointment. And dare I say, a glimmer of hope. He's going to COP26. We shall see if his political side takes precedent over his climate side. So, TBD, we shall see what happens with that. But I'd definitely put that under the banner of good news for this week. Thanks for listening, folks. Stay tuned, and we're living in interesting times.
That's this week's Friday episode of Earth Feels. Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for